What most people misunderstand about trauma is that it doesn't simply leave scars. It rewires perception. A trauma-born empath isn't walking through the world reacting like everyone else. They're scanning, calculating, reading between the lines of every interaction, because at some point in their life, that ability wasn't optional. It was necessary. When you grow up in an environment where emotions are unpredictable, where safety can shift without warning, your brain adapts. It becomes efficient at picking up micro-expressions, subtle tone changes, inconsistencies between words and intent. This isn't overthinking. This is pattern recognition trained under pressure. And over time, that awareness sharpens into something most people never develop. They can sit in a room and feel tension before a single word is spoken. They can sense discomfort behind a smile, resentment behind politeness, insecurity behind confidence. It's not mystical, it's neurological conditioning paired with emotional intelligence. But here's where the misunderstanding begins. From the outside, this level of awareness looks like sensitivity. It looks like someone who feels too much, reacts too deeply, or takes things too personally. But that interpretation misses the mechanism entirely. They're not reacting more, they're detecting more. There's a difference. Most people move through conversations at face value. A trauma-born empath is processing layers. What's being said, what's being avoided, and what's being implied. And because they're absorbing all of that simultaneously, it can become overwhelming. This is where the cost shows up. Because when you don't just notice emotions, but actually internalize them, you lose the natural boundary that most people rely on. Someone else's stress becomes your tension. Someone else's anger becomes your unease. Someone else's sadness becomes your weight to carry. And if that isn't managed, it creates a constant state of psychological fatigue. Now think about what that does over time. You start to anticipate problems before they happen. You start adjusting your behavior to maintain stability, to avoid conflict, to keep the emotional environment predictable. You become highly adaptable, but also highly responsible for things that were never yours to control. That's why many trauma-born empaths grow into adults who are incredibly perceptive, but quietly exhausted. They've mastered the external world while slowly disconnecting from their internal one. And yet, this same mechanism, the one that creates the overwhelm, is also the source of their strength. Because the ability to read people accurately, to understand motivations, to recognize emotional patterns, that's power when it's directed, not just absorbed. The difference comes down to awareness of the awareness itself. If they never question it, they remain reactive, pulled into every emotional current around them. But if they learn to step back and observe without absorbing, that same sensitivity becomes precision. It becomes clarity. It becomes control. So the issue was never that they felt too much. The issue is that no one taught them where to stop feeling. Once you understand that level of constant awareness, the next part starts to make sense in a way most people completely miss. What looks like withdrawal is often self-preservation. For a trauma-born empath, solitude is not the absence of connection. It's the absence of noise. It's the only environment where they're not required to process, interpret, and emotionally manage the people around them. And when you've spent years, sometimes decades, doing that unconsciously, silence doesn't feel empty. It feels like relief. This is where the narrative gets distorted. From the outside, people assume that someone who spends a lot of time alone must be struggling socially, emotionally disconnected, or even avoiding life. But in reality, many of these individuals are doing the exact opposite. They are regulating, they are recovering, they are creating a space where their nervous system can finally come out of a constant state of alert. Because here's the truth most people don't consider. Connection is only nourishing when it's safe. If your past has taught you that closeness comes with unpredictability, emotional volatility, or hidden expectations, then your brain doesn't categorize connection as comfort. It categorizes it as risk. So you adapt. You start choosing environments where you can control the input. You become selective with your interactions. You limit exposure, not because you don't value people, but because you've learned that not all energy is neutral. Some of it drains, some of it destabilizes, and some of it pulls you back into patterns you've worked hard to understand. And over time, solitude becomes associated with clarity, with stability, with a sense of self that isn't constantly being shaped by external emotional forces. But there's a tension here, because the same person who finds peace in being alone is also wired for depth in connection. They don't want surface-level interaction. They don't want noise. They want something real, something honest, something that doesn't require them to filter themselves or manage the emotional environment. And that creates a paradox. They crave connection, but they've experienced enough of the wrong kind to know the cost. So instead of seeking more, they become more selective. And when that selectivity is misunderstood, they're labeled as distant, guarded, or hard to reach. But it's not distance. It's discernment. They're not closing themselves off from people. They're closing themselves off from chaos. And if that distinction isn't recognized, it creates pressure from others and sometimes from within to re-engage in ways that are misaligned, to tolerate dynamics that feel familiar but are ultimately draining, to trade peace for proximity. This is where many people get stuck, because solitude, while safe, can slowly become a default rather than a choice. What begins as recovery can turn into isolation if it's not balanced with intentional, healthy connection. And that balance requires something most trauma-born empaths were never taught: how to engage without losing themselves, how to be present without absorbing everything, how to connect without overextending, how to stay open without abandoning their boundaries. That's the real work. Because the goal was never to avoid people. The goal was to find a way to be around the right ones without paying the same emotional price. And once that distinction becomes clear, solitude stops being an escape and starts becoming a standard. Because peace isn't something you should have to isolate yourself to experience. It's something you should be able to maintain, no matter who you're around. Once you begin to see how awareness and solitude shape their behavior, another pattern becomes impossible to ignore. It's not just that trauma-born empaths experience the world differently. It's that most people are not equipped to meet them at that level of depth. This is where friction starts to show up in relationships. Because when someone is highly perceptive, they don't just listen to words. They evaluate Ali, no mend. They notice when someone says the right thing, but feels off. They pick up on hesitation, avoidance, subtle contradictions, and without even trying, they begin to see the gap between who someone presents themselves to be and who they actually are. For the average person, that level of perception can feel invasive, even if nothing is being said out loud. It creates a kind of psychological pressure, not because the empath is doing anything aggressive, but because their presence alone disrupts superficial dynamics. You can't maintain a mask as easily around someone who instinctively reads beneath it. And most people, whether consciously or not, rely on some degree of social masking to function. So what happens? Instead of leaning into that depth, many people retreat from it. They start labeling the empath in ways that make the discomfort easier to justify. Too intense, too serious. Over-analyzing. These labels aren't always malicious, but they are revealing. They reflect a mismatch, not a flaw. Because what's really happening is that one person is operating on a surface level and the other is operating several layers deeper at the same time. And that gap is hard to bridge unless both people are willing to meet in the middle. This is why trauma-born empaths often find themselves in a repeating cycle. They connect quickly, not because they're careless, but because they recognize emotional patterns rapidly. They see potential, depth, meaning. But over time, they also see inconsistency, avoidance, or emotional limitation in the other person. And once that becomes clear, the connection starts to feel imbalanced. They're engaging at a level the other person isn't prepared to sustain. Now, here's where it becomes critical to understand the dynamic correctly. The issue isn't that the empath is too much. The issue is that depth requires capacity and not E. Very one has developed the emotional awareness, honesty, or stability to operate at that level consistently. So, instead of adapting upward, many people disengage. They pull away, create distance, or subtly reduce the intensity of the interaction. Not because the connection is meaningless, but because maintaining it at that depth requires confronting parts of themselves they may not be ready to face. And for the empath, this can be confusing at first, because from their perspective, they haven't changed anything. They're simply being consistent, observant, present, engaged. But what they're encountering is the limit of the other person's emotional bandwidth. That's the moment where clarity replaces confusion. They begin to realize that not every connection is meant to last, not because it lacks value, but because it lacks alignment. And once that realization sets in, they stop trying to reduce themselves to make others comfortable. They stop translating their depth into something more digestible. Because depth isn't the problem, misalignment is. And the sooner that distinction is understood, the sooner they can stop chasing connections that were never built to hold them. Because the reality is simple. Not everyone walks away because you're too much. Some people walk away because they're not enough for where you operate. And once you see how this pattern unfolds, heightened awareness, selective solitude, and repeated misalignment in relationships, you start to notice the real risk isn't external. It's internal. Because over time, a trauma-born empath can become so skilled at understanding others that they slowly lose clarity about themselves. Think about the conditioning involved. When you've spent years reading emotional environments, anticipating reactions, adjusting your behavior to maintain stability, your attention is almost always directed outward. You're tracking other people's needs, moods, and intentions with precision. But that same level of attention is rarely turned inward. And that creates an imbalance. You begin to justify things you shouldn't tolerate. Not because you lack intelligence, but because you have too much understanding. You can explain why someone behaves the way they do. You can trace their patterns back to their own experiences, their own wounds, their own limitations. And that insight, while accurate, becomes dangerous when it overrides your boundaries. Because understanding someone is not the same as excusing them. But for many trauma-born empaths, those two lines blur. They stay longer than they should. They give more than is reciprocated. They absorb emotional weight that was never theirs to carry. And they do it quietly, often without confrontation.